Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. In the heart of Topkapi Palace, a secret changes the destiny of an empire. A prince, long thought lost to madness in the gilded prison known as the Kafes, is about to be crowned. He is Mustafa I, the holy fool, the broken mind, the man who would be sultan not once, but twice. His story is not one of conquest, but of survival. A terrifying journey through the darkest corridors of power, where a man's sanity was the price of his life, and the throne was the most dangerous place on earth. In the gilded heart of the Ottoman Empire, within the labyrinthine walls of the Topkapi Palace, power was not merely inherited, it was seized from the cold hands of family. To be an Ottoman prince was to be born with a death sentence, one that could be carried out at any moment by the very brother with whom you shared a childhood. This brutal reality was codified by Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees. His infamous law, a chillingly pragmatic piece of statecraft, declared, "For the welfare of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the sultanate may lawfully put his brothers to death." It was a law designed to prevent the devastating civil wars that had nearly torn the empire apart in its infancy. But in solving one problem, it created a new, intimate horror. The practice was known as fratricide, and it became the dark pulse of the dynasty for centuries. The execution itself was a grim ritual, steeped in tradition and a strange reverence for royal blood. The condemned prince would not be touched by a blade, for it was considered sacrilege to spill the blood of Osman's descendants. Instead, the executioners, often deaf-mutes to ensure their silence and loyalty, would carry out their duty with a silken cord. This crimson or green cord, soft to the touch yet unyielding in its purpose, would be wrapped around the prince's neck, a silent, bloodless end to a life of privilege and peril. Every smile from a brother could hide a dagger's intent. Every shared meal could be a prelude to a final, desperate struggle. This was the world into which Mustafa was born, a world where love and kinship were luxuries overshadowed by the absolute, terrifying necessity of survival. The silken cord was not just an instrument of death, it was a symbol of the ever-present threat that defined princely existence, a ghost that haunted the cradle of every male born to the House of Osman. The terror of the silken cord was not an abstract concept for Prince Mustafa. It was the defining event of his childhood, a massacre that stained the very foundations of his home. His father, Sultan Mehmed III, ascended the throne in 1595, and his first act as ruler was to enact the law of fratricide on an unprecedented and horrifying scale. He ordered the immediate execution of all 19 of his brothers and half-brothers. Some were men with families of their own, others were mere infants. Mute executioners fanned out across the palace, their silken cords ending 19 lives in a single night of state-sanctioned slaughter. The bodies were carried out of the palace, a grim procession that announced the arrival of a new, ruthless sultan. Young Mustafa, born in 1591, was just a small child, but the palace would have echoed with the whispers and silent screams of that night for years to come. He grew up in a court traumatized by this event, a place where the memory of dead princes was a constant, unspoken warning. His world was one of opulence and fear, his every step shadowed by the knowledge of what his own father was capable of. He had an older brother, Mahmud, a popular and promising prince who was seen as a threat by their father. In 1603, based on whispers of conspiracy, Mehmed III had Mahmud executed. Mustafa, now around 12 years old, had witnessed his father murder his uncles and then his own brother. This left only Mustafa and his other brother, Ahmed. When Mehmed III died later that same year, the 13-year-old Ahmed ascended the throne. Suddenly, Mustafa's life was in his brother's hands. The executioners awaited the new sultan's command. Every creak of a floorboard, every unannounced visitor could have signaled his end. This was not a childhood. It was a prolonged state of terror, an education in paranoia and powerlessness that would leave indelible scars on his fragile mind. When Sultan Mehmed I took the throne, the empire held its breath. The law was clear. The precedent was horrifying. The executioners stood ready for the order to dispatch his younger brother, Mustafa. But the order never came. Whether it was due to his youth, a pang of conscience after witnessing his own father's brutality, or the political counsel of his advisors who saw the danger of an heirless dynasty, Ahmed made a revolutionary decision. He would not kill Mustafa. Instead, he would imprison him. This act of mercy, however, was the beginning of a new and insidious form of torture. Mustafa was confined to a section of the Topkapi Palace that would become infamous, the Kafes, or the cage. It was not a dungeon of stone and iron bars, but a suite of lavish, opulent rooms, decorated with the finest silks and tiles. It was a prison of luxury, but a prison nonetheless. For 14 years, from his brother's accession until his death, Mustafa lived in absolute seclusion. He was sealed off from the world, with no news, no visitors, and no purpose. His only companions were a handful of deaf-mute servants and concubines who could neither speak nor conspire. The windows were bricked up or barred, allowing only slivers of light. Day after day, year after year, he existed in this gilded box, under the constant crushing weight of isolation and the ever-present fear that his brother might change his mind. The Kafes was designed to neutralize a prince, to keep him alive as an insurance policy for the dynasty, while preventing him from gathering followers. But it had a devastating, unintended consequence. It became an incubator for madness. The sensory deprivation, the crippling boredom, the unending paranoia, and the lack of human connection began to erode Mustafa's sanity. His mind, already scarred by the traumas of his youth, began to fracture. He would pace for hours, talk to himself, and fall into deep depressions, his behavior growing more erratic and disturbed with each passing year. The cage saved his body, but it slowly, methodically, destroyed his mind. In the autumn of 1617, a plague of typhus swept through Istanbul, and it did not spare the Sultan. Mehmed I, still a young man at 27, fell gravely ill. As he lay on his deathbed, the court was thrown into a crisis of succession. Ahmed had several sons, but the eldest, Osman, was only 13 years old. Placing a child on the throne of a vast and turbulent empire was a perilous move, one that could invite rebellion from the military and intrigue from ambitious pashas. The senior officials of the Divan, along with the powerful Valide Sultan, were faced with an unprecedented dilemma. For generations, the throne had passed from father to son. But crowning the young Osman would mean passing over his uncle, Mustafa, who was still locked away in the Kafes. The law of fratricide, ironically, had always simplified succession. Now, Ahmed's mercy had complicated it. As his life ebbed away, Sultan Ahmed made a final, dynasty-altering decision. He decreed that upon his death, the throne should not pass to his young son, but to his own brother, Mustafa. This act shattered centuries of tradition. It replaced the principle of primogeniture, succession by the eldest son, with the principle of agnatic seniority, where the throne would pass to the oldest living male in the dynasty. It was a desperate gamble, born of a desire to protect his young children from the very law he himself had defied, and to ensure a mature ruler sat on the throne. But the man they were about to crown was a ghost, a recluse whose sanity was a matter of grim speculation. The court knew he was unwell. Yet, the alternative of a child sultan seemed worse. And so, the decision was made. For the first time in Ottoman history, a living sultan would be succeeded by his brother. The order was given. The heavy doors of the Kafes, sealed for 14 long years, were unbolted. As light flooded the chamber, it fell upon a trembling, bewildered man who was about to be dragged from the depths of solitary madness and placed upon the most powerful throne in the Islamic world. When Sultan Mehmed I succumbed to typhus in 1617, the Ottoman Empire faced a crisis unlike any it had ever known. For centuries, The law of the throne was simple and brutal. The new sultan would execute his brothers to secure his reign. But Ahmed, haunted by the execution of his own brother, had spared his younger sibling Mustafa, confining him instead to the Kafes, the gilded cage within the palace. Now, with Ahmed's own sons still children, a powerful faction led by the Grand Vizier and Qasem Sultan made a fateful decision. To protect the young princes from the very law of fratricide, they would shatter tradition. They would not enthrone Ahmed's 14-year-old son, Osman. Instead, they would retrieve the forgotten prince, Mustafa, from the darkness. After 14 years of absolute isolation, what emerged from the Kafes was not a man, but the ghost of one. The accession ceremony was a spectacle of horror and pity. Mustafa, now 26, blinked in the sudden light, his eyes wide with a terror that had become his only companion. He was gaunt, his gaze unfocused, his movements erratic and childlike. He flinched from the officials who tried to dress him in the imperial robes, and when presented before the court to receive their allegiance, he mumbled incoherently, his words a meaningless jumble. The pashas and viziers, men who had served a succession of powerful, commanding sultans, now bowed before a broken soul who seemed to believe they were part of a terrifying dream. He was seen trying to run back to the safety of his cell, screaming that he preferred his cage to this overwhelming new world. The awe and majesty of the Ottoman throne, the very symbol of divine authority on earth, was now occupied by a man whose mind had been hollowed out by fear and loneliness. The gamble to save the young princes had placed an imbecile at the helm of the world's most powerful empire, and no one knew what would happen next. The daily functions of the empire ground to a halt. The Divan, the imperial council where the fate of nations was decided, became a theatre of the absurd. The Grand Vizier would present urgent matters of state, a rebellion in the provinces, a diplomatic crisis with Venice, only to be met with a vacant stare from the throne. Sultan Mustafa I would sit, sometimes plucking at the jewels on his robes, sometimes bursting into fits of laughter or tears for no apparent reason. His behavior grew more bizarre with each passing day. He would wander the palace gardens, convinced he was a bird, or sail out onto the Bosphorus and shower the water with gold coins, shouting that he was feeding his fish and paying his navy. On one infamous occasion, during a formal meeting, he began to playfully tear the turbans from the heads of his most senior and decorated pashas, treating them like toys in a nursery. Power, however, abhors a vacuum. With the Sultan incapable of rule, a shadow government began to form. His mother, Halime Sultan, who had long dreamed of this moment, tried to rule through him, issuing commands in his name, but she lacked the political acumen to command the respect of the hardened statesmen of the Divan. The Grand Vizier and the Shaykhul Islam, the chief religious authority, found themselves making decisions unilaterally, forging the Sultan's seal on documents he could not even read. The whispers in the palace corridors grew louder. This was not just an embarrassment, it was a mortal danger to the state. The Janissaries, the elite infantry who were the true kingmakers, grew restless. They respected strength, not madness. The empire was a ship without a captain, adrift in treacherous waters, and the men who held the oars were beginning to realize that the figurehead on the prow was a hollow shell, threatening to sink them all. The bizarre spectacle could not continue. After just 96 days, the imperial elite reached a grim consensus. The experiment had failed. Mustafa was not a holy fool touched by God, as some had hoped. He was simply a man broken beyond repair, and his presence on the throne was an open wound on the honor of the Ottoman dynasty. For the first time in history, the state faced the challenge of deposing a sultan, not for tyranny, cruelty, or incompetence, but for his profound mental incapacity. This required a delicate touch, a justification that would prevent the act from being seen as simple treason. The Shaykhul Islam Asad Effendi was called upon to provide the ultimate legal and religious cover. He issued a historic fatwa, a religious decree, stating that a ruler who lacked the mental faculties to comprehend his duties was unfit to lead the caliphate. It was a mercy, they argued, both to the empire and to the man himself. The dethronement was not a violent coup, but a quiet, somber procedure. There was no battle in the palace courtyards, no bloodshed. A small delegation of high-ranking officials approached the Sultan's chambers. He was found, as usual, in a state of agitated confusion. He likely did not understand the documents being read to him, nor the gravity of the moment. For him, it was merely another confusing episode in a life defined by powerlessness. He was gently stripped of the imperial regalia that had never truly fit him and was escorted from the grand halls of state. His destination was a place of tragic familiarity. He was led back down the shadowed corridors, past the watchful eyes of the court, and returned to the silent, suffocating confines of the Kafes. The door was locked once more. The brief, chaotic reign was over. The throne was vacant again, but the precedent had been set. A sultan of the House of Osman could be removed. With Mustafa I safely locked away, the state turned to the boy who should have ruled in the first place, Mehmed I's eldest son, Osman. At only 14 years old, Osman II ascended the throne in 1618, a figure of striking contrast to his unfortunate uncle. Where Mustafa was vacant and terrified, Osman was sharp, ambitious, and radiated an intense, almost ferocious energy. He was a product of a rigorous princely education, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Italian, a gifted poet, and a formidable horseman. To the troubled court, his coronation felt like a restoration of order, a return to the ideal of the warrior-scholar sultan who had built the empire. He was seen as a new hope, a chance to wash away the shame of the last 3 months. Osman, however, was no one's puppet. He possessed a keen intellect and a reformer's zeal, and he looked upon the state of his empire with the critical eye of youth. He saw corruption in the divan, laziness in the bureaucracy, and, most dangerously, decay within the Janissary corps. He believed the elite soldiers had become too powerful, too involved in politics, and too comfortable in their Istanbul barracks. He dreamed of forging a new, loyal army from the hardy peoples of Anatolia and Egypt, and even contemplated moving the empire's capital away from the toxic political environment of Constantinople. These were radical, revolutionary ideas that struck at the very heart of the Ottoman power structure. His impatience and disdain for the old guard quickly earned him powerful enemies. While he projected an image of strength and renewal, the ghost of his uncle lingered. In the Kafes, Mustafa remained a living, breathing alternative, a pawn that could be used by those who felt threatened by the young sultan's audacious plans. The stage was being set for another, far more violent chapter in the empire's history. The winter of 1622 was a season of bitter cold and simmering rage in Constantinople. The discontent that had been brewing against the young, ambitious Sultan Osman II was about to boil over. Osman was a reformer, a visionary in his own mind, but to the old guard, he was a threat. He saw the rot in the state, particularly within the Janissary corps, the elite infantry that had become a parasitic power unto itself. He planned to curb their influence, to slash their pay, and, most damningly, to raise a new, loyal army of Anatolian Turks to replace them. This was not just reform, it was a declaration of war against the very institution that had guarded the throne for centuries. The Janissaries heard the whispers. They saw the Sultan's disdain in his every action. He had taken a wife from outside the palace, breaking with tradition. He was planning a pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey they suspected was a mere pretext to recruit his new army far from their watchful eyes in the capital. Every move was an insult, a chip at their venerable status. As the snows fell, so did the last vestiges of their loyalty. The ulama, the religious establishment, fanned the flames, angered by Osman's modernizing tendencies and his disregard for their counsel. Behind the scenes, the shadowy faction loyal to the caged Mustafa and his mother, Halime Sultan, saw their moment. They had waited patiently in the darkness, and now the chaos was their ladder. The spark ignited in the barracks and spread like wildfire through the city's narrow streets. Chanting, roaring, a river of steel and fury flowed towards the Topkapi Palace. They were not just demanding coin or privileges, they were demanding the heads of the Sultan's advisors. They stormed the outer courtyards, their rage echoing off the ancient walls. Inside, Osman II, barely a man at 18, found himself trapped. The palace that was his birthright, the symbol of his absolute power, had become his prison. The men sworn to die for him were now howling for his blood at the gates. The balance of power had shattered, and the night was just beginning. The unthinkable had happened. The sacred precinct of the palace was breached. The mob of janissaries, guided by treacherous officials like the new Grand Vizier Kara Davud Pasha, swarmed the inner sanctums. Sultan Osman II, stripped of his guards and his authority, was a fugitive in his own home. He tried to reason with them, appearing before them to plead his case, but his words were drowned out by a deafening roar for vengeance. He was no longer the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth. He was a cornered animal. They found him hiding in the quarters of the Aga of the Janissaries, a final desperate appeal for loyalty that went unanswered. He was dragged out, his royal turban knocked from his head, his fine robes torn. He was subjected to the ultimate humiliation, paraded through the streets of his own capital on a common cart, exposed to the jeers and insults of the very people he ruled. This was a spectacle of shattered majesty, a visceral message that no sultan was beyond the reach of the Janissaries' wrath. The journey ended at the infamous Yedikul fortress, the fortress of the Seven Towers, a place of execution and despair from which few returned. There, in a cold, damp cell, the final act of this tragedy unfolded. The order for his death was given, sanctioned by the new regime under Halime Sultan. Osman fought for his life with the desperation of a young man who had held the world in his hands only hours before. But he was overwhelmed. The accounts are brutal and explicit. He was strangled with a bowstring, the traditional Ottoman method of executing royalty. To prove the deed was done, his ear was severed and presented to Halime Sultan. The body of a sultan, a descendant of Osman Ghazi, lay broken on a stone floor. For the first time in the empire's history, the divinely ordained ruler had been murdered by his own subjects. A sacred line had been crossed, and the bloodstain of this regicide would seep deep into the foundations of the dynasty, a haunting precedent for the dark times to come. With Osman II's body still warm, the victorious rebels and their political masters faced a pressing question: who would sit on the blood-soaked throne? The answer was as inevitable as it was tragic. They turned back to the man they had deposed just 4 years earlier, Mustafa. He was the only other living male of the royal line, the key to legitimacy. A delegation of viziers and janissary officers made their way to the Kafes, the gilded cage where Mustafa had been reinterred. For years, he had languished there in solitude, the darkness of his confinement mirroring the darkness in his mind. The silence of his prison was shattered by the splintering of wood as they forced the door. Mustafa, now a man in his early 30s, was found cowering in a corner, emaciated and terrified. He was no longer the bewildered youth of his first reign. He was a broken soul, haunted by the ghosts of his long isolation. When he saw the armed men, he did not see saviors. He saw executioners. He screamed, convinced they had come to kill him, just as they had killed his nephew Osman. He begged for his life, his pleas incoherent and pathetic. He had no grasp of the political earthquake that had just shaken the empire. He only understood fear. They had to physically seize him. He fought back, clawing and crying, a frantic, desperate struggle against a fate he could not comprehend. This was not an ascension. It was an abduction. They dragged the trembling, weeping man from the darkness of his cell, through the palace corridors, and into the throne room. There, they forcibly placed him upon the throne of the Ottoman Empire for the second time. His eyes were vacant, darting around the room in terror and confusion. He was a puppet king in the most literal sense, a hollow shell placed on display to legitimize a coup. The power did not reside in the man on the throne, but in the hands of those who had dragged him there. His ruthlessly ambitious mother, Halime Sultan, and her son-in-law, the regicide Grand Vizier, Kara Davud Pasha. The empire now had a sultan who was a prisoner of his own shattered mind. Mustafa's second reign was not a reign at all. It was a regency of chaos, orchestrated by his mother, Halime Sultan. Freed from the shadows, she now wielded power with a vengeance born of years of frustration and fear for her son's life. With Grand Vizier Kara Davud Pasha as her enforcer, she purged the court of Osman II's loyalists, rewarding the janissaries who had engineered her return to power. The treasury was thrown open, and the empire's wealth was used to placate the military and enrich her faction. But this was not governance. It was the frantic plundering of a state in freefall. While his mother ruled, Mustafa wandered the palace like a ghost. His madness, once a source of pity, now became a public spectacle of imperial decay. He would spend hours at the waterfront, throwing gold coins to the fish, clapping his hands with childlike glee as they glittered in the sun. He would approach his most powerful viziers and playfully pull at their beards during solemn meetings of the divan. Most disturbingly, he was consumed by the memory of his murdered nephew. He would often run to the palace gates, screaming that Osman was outside, demanding to be let in. He would order his guards to search for the dead sultan, convinced he was merely hiding. The heart of the empire was now presided over by a man who could not distinguish reality from delusion. The rot at the centre spread quickly to the provinces. In the east, the governor of Erzurum, Abaza Mehmed Pasha, rose in a furious rebellion. Fiercely loyal to the slain Osman II, he began a brutal campaign of revenge, hunting down and executing any janissary he could find. His rebellion was not just a challenge to the capital's authority. It was a moral crusade against the crime of regicide. Across the empire, order was collapsing. The janissaries in Constantinople, unpunished and emboldened, became a law unto themselves. The state was rudderless, captained by a vengeful regent and her insane son. The brief, bloody triumph of Halime Sultan was already turning to ash, as new forces began to conspire to remove the madman from the throne once and for all. With Mustafa once again upon the throne, a collective madness seemed to descend upon the Ottoman capital. This was not the restoration of a legitimate ruler, it was the coronation of chaos. The empire, which had just witnessed the shocking regicide of the young and ambitious Osman II, now found itself rudderless, captained by a man whose mind was a storm-tossed sea. His mother, Halime Sultan, and her son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Kara Davud Pasha, held the reins of power, but their grip was born of desperation, not authority. The janissaries, the very kingmakers who had orchestrated this bloody transition, were a law unto themselves. Having tasted the power to unmake a sultan, they roamed the streets of Istanbul not as soldiers, but as masters. Their demands were insatiable. Pay, promotions, and pardons were extorted daily, draining the treasury and eroding the last vestiges of state discipline. The markets, once the vibrant heart of a global empire, grew quiet and fearful. Merchants shuttered their shops, fearing looting by rampaging soldiers. Provincial governors, sensing the weakness at the centre, began to act with impunity. Tax revenues dwindled as local lords carved out their own fiefdoms. From the Safavid frontier in the east to the Habsburg lands in the west, the enemies of the Ottomans watched with keen interest, sensing an unparalleled opportunity. Within the palace walls, Mustafa's behaviour only amplified the sense of dread. He would wander the halls, shouting at imaginary figures, scattering gold coins to fish in the palace fountains, and pulling the beards of his viziers, believing it a grand jest. The business of state ground to a halt. Important petitions went unanswered, and audiences with the Sultan became farcical displays of his profound detachment from reality. The empire was not just leaderless, it was haunted by the ghost of its own stability, a sprawling, powerful entity now convulsing from a sickness in its very head. In the heart of this spiralling chaos stood Grand Vizier Kara Davud Pasha, the architect of Mustafa's return. He had committed the ultimate sin, the murder of a sultan. He believed this act would secure his position, making him indispensable to the new regime. He was tragically mistaken. The stain of Osman II's blood was not a mark of power, but a curse that followed him relentlessly. Halime Sultan, though she had sanctioned the coup, was a shrewd political operator. She saw that Davud Pasha's brutality had made him a focal point for all the discontent simmering in the capital. He was a liability, a lightning rod for the anger of both the political elite and the common soldier. The very janissaries he had empowered now viewed him with contempt. They had wanted Osman deposed, but the brutal, humiliating manner of his death in the dungeons of Yedikule fortress had shocked even the most hardened among them. It was an offence against the sacred blood of the House of Osman. Davud Pasha grew paranoid. He saw enemies in every shadow of the Topkapi Palace. He conducted purges, executing officials he suspected of harbouring sympathies for the late Sultan. But each execution only created more enemies, weaving a tighter web of conspiracy around him. His attempts to restore order in the city failed spectacularly. The soldiers ignored his commands, and the treasury officials, loyal to other factions, stonewalled his efforts to raise funds. He had unleashed a storm he could not control. The breaking point came when Halime Sultan, under immense pressure from other viziers and the powerful mother of the future Sultan, Kosem, decided to sacrifice him. She stripped him of the seal of office, casting him aside. But for a man who had murdered a sultan, mere dismissal was not an option. He was hunted, captured, and subjected to the very fate he had inflicted upon his young sovereign, a brutal execution. His death was a grim lesson in the unforgiving world of Ottoman politics. The hand that sheds royal blood is forever stained and will inevitably be cut off. While Halime Sultan struggled to manage the chaos her son's reign had unleashed, another power was quietly consolidating within the gilded cage of the imperial harem. This was the domain of Kosem Sultan, the favoured consort of the late Sultan Mehmed I and the mother of several princes, including the heir apparent, Murad. During the reign of Osman II, she had been sidelined, sent to the Old Palace, a place of gilded exile for the mothers of deceased sultans. But with Osman's death and the unstable Mustafa on the throne, Kosem's position was transformed. She was no longer a relic of a past reign. She was the mother of the future. Her sons were the only viable alternative to the madness personified by Mustafa. From the shadows, Kosem began to play the long game. She possessed a formidable intelligence, boundless ambition, and a network of loyalists cultivated over many years. Palace eunuchs, viziers who despised the current regime, and even commanders within the Janissary Corps who were appalled by the state of the empire, all became pieces on her chessboard. She communicated through secret letters, her agents moving silently through the palace corridors. While Halime's power was loud, brittle, and based on the temporary loyalty of rebellious soldiers, Kosem's was quiet, deep, and built on the promise of stability. She presented herself and her young son, Murad, as the solution to the anarchy. She was the guardian of dynastic legitimacy against the chaotic usurpation of Halime and the mentally fragile Mustafa. This was a silent war fought not with swords, but with whispers, promises, and bags of gold. Kosem masterfully stoked the fears of the ruling class, reminding them that an empire led by a madman was an empire on the verge of collapse. She was not just a mother protecting her son's birthright. She was positioning herself as the savior of the state, the true Valid Sultan in waiting, whose regency would restore order and sanity to a world gone mad. The second reign of Mustafa I lasted just over a year, but it felt like a lifetime to the citizens of his crumbling empire. The state was bankrupt, the army was in open revolt, and the capital was paralyzed by fear. The political elite, from the highest-ranking viziers to the Sheikhul Islam, reached a terrifying consensus. The dynasty and the empire itself could not survive another season under Mustafa. The final impetus came from a fresh Janissary rebellion, this time not in support of Mustafa, but against the weakness and chaos he represented. They demanded a leader who could command, a sultan who could rule. The conspiracies that Kösem Sultan had so carefully nurtured now came to fruition. A secret council of the most powerful men in the empire was convened. There, the decision was made. Mustafa, the holy fool, the twice-crowned king, had to be deposed for the final time. There would be no more chances. The coup was swift and clinical. On September 10th, 1623, high-ranking pashas and agas of the Janissaries marched to the palace. They did not storm the gates, but were let in by co-conspirators. They found Halime Sultan, who fought desperately to protect her son's position, but her power had evaporated. They proceeded to Mustafa's chambers, where they found the Sultan in a state of confusion. He was gently, almost pitifully, removed and taken back to the Kafes, the gilded cage from which he had twice been summoned. His reign was over, a bizarre and tragic chapter closed. In his place, a terrified 11-year-old boy was brought forth. This was Murad, the son of Kösem Sultan. Dressed in the imperial robes and placed upon the enormous throne of his ancestors, he looked small and overwhelmed. The great men of the empire bowed before him, pledging their allegiance not just to a child, but to the hope he represented. A return to order, a restoration of dignity, and the end of the madness. The empire had a new sultan, but its true ruler for now would be his mother, Kösem, the woman who had outlasted them all. The second reign of Mustafa I was destined to be a footnote, a chaotic interlude written in blood and confusion. The Janissaries who had placed him back on the throne soon found that a puppet who could not hold his own strings was useless. The empire was hemorrhaging authority, the capital was a tinderbox, and the state treasury was being plundered by the very men who claimed to be its guardians. Real power had coalesced elsewhere, in the shadows of the harem, where the formidable Kösem Sultan was playing a long and dangerous game. She had seen enough. The experiment with Mustafa had failed twice, and its continuation threatened to tear the dynasty apart. She needed a ruler she could guide, not a broken man who conversed with ghosts. An agreement was struck with the agas of the Janissaries and the senior viziers. The price for stability was Mustafa's crown. For the second and final time, the doors of the throne room were breached. But this time, there was no grand ceremony, no celebration. It was a somber, almost clinical procedure. Mustafa, perhaps lost in one of his reveries, barely seemed to comprehend the gravity of the moment. He was gently, almost pitifully, guided from the throne he had never truly occupied. His nephew, the 11-year-old Murad, was brought forth to take his place, with Kösem Sultan standing behind him as the official regent, a consolidation of power she had masterfully engineered. As Murad IV was girded with the sword of Osman, Mustafa was led back down the familiar cold stone corridors. He was returning to the only home he had truly known since childhood, the Kafes. The heavy wooden door, which had opened twice to reveal the blinding light of power, now closed behind him for the last time. This time, there would be no reprieve, no third act. The silence that enveloped him was absolute, a final verdict delivered not by a judge, but by the relentless machinery of the state he was unfit to rule. For 16 long years, the empire tried to forget him. While his nephew Murad IV grew from a boy regent into one of the most ruthless and capable sultans in a century, Mustafa languished in his gilded prison. He was no longer a political pawn, a symbol of rebellion, or even a claimant to the throne. He had become something far worse, an inconvenience, a ghost haunting the heart of the palace. His existence was an open secret, a source of dynastic shame. The sounds of the vibrant, brutal world of Murad's reign, the executions in the courtyard, the triumphant marches, the whispers of intrigue, were muffled by the thick stone walls of his chamber. What did he do in all that time? The historical record is almost silent, for the life of a forgotten prince is not the stuff of official chronicles. We are left to imagine the slow, inexorable decay of a mind already shattered. Did he trace patterns on the walls? Did he speak to the birds that landed on his window bars, his only connection to a world outside? did the faces of his mother, his brother Ahmed, and the executioners who had once come for him merge into a single, recurring nightmare. He was fed, he was clothed, but he was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of time with no shore. The guards outside his door were likely instructed not to speak to him, to treat him as a non-person. For Murad IV, who was systematically executing his other brothers to secure his throne, Mustafa's continued existence was a curious anomaly. Perhaps he was considered too mad to be a threat, his mind a more secure prison than any physical cage. Or perhaps Murad, in a rare moment of pity or pragmatism, understood that killing a man who was already dead in spirit served no purpose. And so, Mustafa waited, the forgotten prince in the silent room, his life a long, drawn-out final breath. In the year 1639, after 16 years of solitude, the life of Mustafa I finally came to an end. The official narrative, as is so often the case in the opaque world of the Topkapi Palace, is clean and simple. He died of natural causes. He was 48 years old, his body and mind finally succumbing to a lifetime of trauma and confinement. But in the court of Murad IV, nothing was ever simple, and death was rarely natural. By this time, Murad had become a master of state-sanctioned terror. He had already executed his brothers Bayezid, Suleiman, and Qasim to eliminate any potential rivals. With each silken bowstring pulled taut, Murad's paranoia was fed, not sated. Why then was Mustafa, the one brother who had actually tasted power, allowed to die peacefully in his bed? Many historians believe the official story is a convenient fiction. The timing is deeply suspicious. Murad IV was about to embark on his dangerous but ultimately triumphant Baghdad campaign. It was common practice for a sultan to clean house before leaving the capital for a long war, ensuring no rebellions could form around a rival claimant in his absence. Mustafa, however mad, still possessed the blood of Osman. He was a living symbol, and Murad was not a man who left symbols to chance. The alternative narrative is colder and far more plausible. On a quiet night, with no fanfare, the palace executioners would have entered the Kafes. There would have been no struggle. To Mustafa, they may have been indistinguishable from the phantoms that already populated his world. The bowstring would have been quick, the end silent. His death was not recorded with the ceremony of a former sultan, but with the quiet disposal of a state secret. Whether by illness or by strangulation, the result was the same. The man who sat on the throne twice, who survived fratricide, and who endured decades of madness, finally found his release in the one certainty of the empire: death. Mustafa I's life was a tragedy, but his legacy was a paradox that would haunt the Ottoman dynasty for centuries. His survival, initially seen as a humane alternative to the brutal law of fratricide, inadvertently cemented a new and arguably crueler system, the Kafes. The terror and instability of his two brief reigns served as the ultimate cautionary tale. It proved to the Ottoman elite that allowing multiple adult princes to live was a catastrophic risk if one of them could be used as a pawn. The solution was not to return to systematic murder, but to perfect the system of imprisonment. After Mustafa, the Kafes became an ironclad institution, the default path for all non-reigning princes. This had a devastating, long-term effect on the quality of Ottoman leadership. Instead of being raised as governors in the provinces, learning the arts of war and administration, future sultans spent decades in gilded cages. They ascended the throne not as experienced statesmen, but as pale, paranoid men, psychologically scarred by decades of isolation and the constant fear of the executioner's bowstring. They were often socially inept, ignorant of the world beyond their prison walls, and easily manipulated by viziers, their mothers, or the Janissary corps. The empire, which had once been led by warrior poets and brilliant strategists like Mehmed the Conqueror and Suleiman the Magnificent, was now increasingly in the hands of men broken by their own succession system. Mustafa's story was the justification for it all. His madness became the spectre used to frighten the court into accepting the necessity of the Kafes. In a profound irony, the attempt to save one prince from death led to a system that slowly suffocated the genius of an entire dynasty, contributing to the long, slow decline of the very empire it was meant to preserve. The mad Sultan, in his own tragic way, had set the stage for the twilight of the Ottomans,